The siege had dragged on for 3 relentless days when the arrow found her. From the high ramparts of Montfort la Roche, Lady Isabeau stood beneath the pale Breton sky, her armor glinting faintly through the smoke of war. She had not meant to be there. A lady of noble birth was expected to pray for victory, not command it. But her husband was away fighting for the French crown, and the defense of their lands had fallen to her. Beneath the roar of catapults and the hiss of arrows, she felt both terror and a fierce, reckless pride. Every soldier who looked up saw her standing tall at the parapet, her banner trailing like fire in the wind. She was their courage made flesh, until one moment's defiance became her undoing. The arrow came from nowhere, an unremarkable shaft among thousands, loosed from the chaos below. It struck just beneath her right shoulder, sliding between chain and flesh. She staggered back, clutching the wound. No one heard her gasp amid the noise. No one saw the color drain from her face. She did not fall. She ordered her guards to keep their line, her voice steady even as her fingers came away red. To retreat before her men was unthinkable. But by nightfall, her arm hung heavy at her side, and fever shimmered in her eyes. When the last fires of battle dimmed, her ladies found her slumped against the battlements. They carried her inside, armor clattering against stone. The castle smelled of blood, smoke, and damp straw, a world suspended between victory and decay. A priest came first, as was custom. He pressed a hand to her brow and muttered prayers, sprinkling holy water that sizzled on her burning skin. Then came the household healer, an old woman with trembling hands and eyes that had seen too much. She poured wine into the wound, packed it with crushed herbs, and whispered that the poison of the arrow would soon fade. But it did not fade. By dawn, her arm had swollen grotesquely, the skin stretched tight and hot as iron from the forge. The sweet scent of infection drifted through the chamber. Her pulse thudded weakly. Each breath came shorter, shallower, as though the air itself were turning against her. Her steward begged her to rest. "You have done enough, my lady." But she shook her head, lips pale and dry. "Montfort stands while I do." Pride still burned where strength had fled. She sent messages to the outer walls, ordered the gates secured, the wounded tended. Yet by the second night, even her voice began to falter. Her ladies saw it then, the fear beneath her resolve. In the flicker of torchlight, she looked less like a warrior and more like a ghost rehearsing her own passing. The priest, desperate, suggested calling for a surgeon. At the word, a hush fell. In the 14th century, the word surgeon carried a weight somewhere between hope and horror. These were not learned physicians of Paris or Bologna. They were barbers, butchers, soldiers, men of scars and stains who worked where priests dared not look. Their knives were their wisdom, and their art was born of necessity, not mercy. To summon one was to admit that God and prayer had failed. But Lady Isabeau was slipping away, and failure was already in the room. The messenger rode out before dawn, spurring his horse through mist and mud to the nearby village of Pont-Aubin. There, in a thatched hut by the river, lived a man called Guillaume Lafleur, known for setting bones and lancing boils when priests turned their backs. Some said he had once studied with the barber surgeons of Rouen. Others swore he had learned his craft on corpses taken from battlefields. When he arrived at the castle gate by sunset, the guards drew back in silence. He was small, wiry, his face hidden beneath a hood stiff with dried blood. He carried a leather satchel that clinked faintly as he walked. The sound of metal against glass, the smell of vinegar followed him, sharp, medicinal, alien amid the scent of wax and roses. Lady Isabeau's steward met him at the threshold. "You are the surgeon." The man inclined his head. "If the lady still breathes, I can ease her suffering." The steward hesitated, as if hearing both promise and threat in the same breath. Still, he led him up the winding stairs, past tapestries and candlelight that seemed to shrink away from the stranger's shadow. At her door, the surgeon paused. He wiped his hands on a cloth already stained dark. "No one must disturb me," he said softly, "and you must have faith." The steward frowned. "In God." The man looked up. His eyes were pale and expressionless. "In me," when he entered. The torches flickered as if the air recoiled. Lady Isabeau stirred on the bed, her lips parting. "Who is it?" "Your salvation, my lady," the steward whispered, though his voice betrayed doubt. The surgeon stepped closer, and the room seemed smaller for his presence. His gaze lingered on the wound, his hand hovering, as if feeling the heat of her fever without touching her. He gave a single nod, curt and unreadable. "It will have to be done tonight." And with that, he opened his satchel. Inside gleamed the cruel simplicity of his trade: knives, irons, saws, linen, and vials of dark liquid. Her ladies crossed themselves. The priest turned away. In the Middle Ages, salvation often came wrapped in steel, and as the surgeon laid out his tools one by one, the whisper spread through the castle like a chill wind. The Lady of Montfort would live, or she would die by the surgeon's knife. Night fell heavy over Montfort, La Roche, swallowing the banners and battlements in mist. Within the castle walls, every sound seemed muffled: the distant clank of armor, the hiss of the hearth, the shallow breaths of a dying lady. Guillaume Lefebvre, the barber surgeon, moved like a man accustomed to the company of silence. He unpacked his instruments upon a wooden table, arranging them with methodical care. The blades caught the candlelight in thin flashes: a curved scalpel, a pair of iron tongs, a bone saw no longer sharp but serviceable. Beside them, a bowl of wine for washing and another of vinegar for cleansing. Though both reeked equally of old blood, Lady Isabeau watched him from the bed, her head resting against sweat-dampened linen. Fever glazed her eyes, yet she studied him as though by sheer will she could divine his intent. "You have done this before?" she murmured. The man did not look up. "100 times," he said, "and only a few I could not save." He did not say how many. The priest lingered by the door, his rosary twisting between nervous fingers. "She is the daughter of a noble house," he warned softly. "Her soul must not be imperiled." Guillaume turned then, his face half in shadow. "Her soul," he said, "is your business, Father. Her flesh is mine." The words struck like a slap, but no one answered. No one dared. He stepped closer to the bed, peeling away the bandage from her shoulder. The cloth came free with a wet sound, followed by the stench of rot. The flesh beneath was discolored, purple-green, glistening like something already claimed by death. The surgeon pressed gently, and Isabeau's body arched in pain. A thin ribbon of pus escaped the wound and slid down her arm. One of her ladies gasped and turned aside, choking back a sob. "The poison is deep," Guillaume said. "If it reaches the heart, she will not see morning." He wiped his hands on a rag and began issuing orders. "Boil water. Bring wine. I will need 4 strong men to hold her, and a steady flame for the irons." At the mention of irons, fear rippled through the room. One of the maids whispered, "You mean to burn her?" The surgeon looked at her with a trace of impatience. "I mean to live." They obeyed. Within moments, servants hurried to and fro, fetching pitchers, clean cloths, buckets of water from the kitchen. The air thickened with heat and dread. Lady Isabeau tried to lift herself, but her body betrayed her. She was weak, her arm numb, her lips trembling as though from cold. "Tell me what you will do," she said. Guillaume met her gaze, and for the first time his expression softened. "I will cut away the rot, my lady," he said quietly. "Then I will burn what cannot be cut. The fire will drive out the poison, "Will it hurt?" "Only once," he replied. The words hung in the air like a prophecy. The priest began murmuring the Ave Maria, his voice low and uneven. The surgeon ignored him. He poured wine over the instruments, the liquid darkening as it touched metal. Steam rose from the cauldron where irons glowed red. When all was ready, Guillaume stepped back and studied his patient. She was beautiful still, even in sickness. Her face pale as parchment, her dark hair clinging to her temples. He wondered briefly if she would curse him when the pain began. Most did. He drew his knife and gestured to the guards. "Hold her." The men obeyed, their hands rough but reluctant. One held her shoulders, another her wrist, another her legs. She tensed as the knife touched her skin, but she did not scream. Not yet. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. The candles flickered. The surgeon worked swiftly, slicing through dead flesh with steady precision. Blood welled up, hot and thick, soaking the linen beneath her. Isabeau's eyes flew open, and her voice broke into a strangled cry. The sound filled the chamber, echoing through the corridors beyond. One of her ladies fled into the hallway, sobbing. Another collapsed to her knees, crossing herself again and again. "Hold her," Guillaume barked. "If she moves, she dies." The guards pressed down harder. The knife went deeper. The smell of iron and salt filled the air. Then, abruptly, the surgeon stopped. He lifted the blade, glistening red, and set it aside. "Now," he said, "the fire." A servant brought the first iron from the hearth, glowing white at its tip. The heat shimmered. Guillaume nodded, and the iron descended. The hiss came first, sharp, unnatural, followed by the scream. Isabeau's body convulsed, her voice tearing through the stillness. The scent of burning flesh joined that of blood and vinegar. It was unbearable, yet no one moved. The priest covered his ears. One of the soldiers turned away, retching. The surgeon pressed the iron again, sealing the wound with fire. Then silence. It was over. Guillaume exhaled, his brow shining with sweat. He dropped the iron into the water, where it hissed and died. "It is done," he said simply. Lady Isabeau lay limp, her breathing ragged, her face streaked with tears. "She will sleep," he added, almost to himself. "If the fever does not return, she may yet live." He turned to the steward. "Watch her tonight. If she wakes, give her wine. If she does not," he trailed off, gathering his instruments. The steward's voice trembled. "And if she dies?" Guillaume's eyes flicked toward the bed, where the lady lay pale against the linen. "Then you will have paid dearly for nothing." He packed his satchel, wiped his hands clean, and left without another word. Behind him, the chamber was silent but for the faint crackle of the dying fire and the slow, uneven rhythm of a woman's breath. Outside, the storm broke. Rain lashed against the stone, washing the blood from the courtyard, but not from the memory of those who had heard her scream. Dawn never came to the chamber of Lady Isabeau. Outside, the rain had ceased, but within, the world remained dark. Curtains drawn, candles guttering, air thick with the metallic ghost of blood and ash. The bedclothes were stiff where the wound had bled through. Her attendants moved silently, afraid to touch her, afraid to wake what might not yet be living. The surgeon's footsteps had long since vanished down the corridor. He had left as silently as he'd come, his work complete, his conscience unburdened. To him, the night's screams were only the sounds of craft, but to those who'd heard them, they were the sound of something breaking. The fragile divide between mercy and cruelty. Lady Isabeau drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she thought she was still on the battlements, hearing arrows whistle through smoke. Sometimes she thought she could feel the sea breeze of her childhood brushing her face. Then the pain returned, deep, throbbing, animal, and she remembered the knife. Her ladies bathed her forehead and prayed aloud. whispering between their tears. The priest sat slumped in a chair near the hearth, his rosary hanging loose in his hand. His prayers had run out hours ago. By midday, the fever rose again. Her skin gleamed with sweat. Her pulse raced and faltered. Beneath the bandages, the wound wept anew. The flesh that had been burned black began to ooze. The smell was worse than before, a foul sweetness that drew flies to the shutters. One of the maids fled the chamber, retching. Another crossed herself and murmured. The surgeon's work was cursed. The steward silenced her with a glare, but his own hands were trembling. He knew the truth, none dared speak. The knife had not saved her. It had only delayed her dying. As dusk returned, a storm gathered again outside. The sky over Brittany burned violet and gray, and the wind moaned through the arrow slits, like the voices of the dead inside. The candles threw long, restless shadows that seemed to crawl up the walls. Lady Isabeau stirred. Her lips moved soundlessly, then formed words. Faint, hoarse. Water, she whispered. A servant rushed forward, but she shook her head. Not for me, for the garden, the roses. Her voice trailed off. Her eyes drifted toward the window, unfocused. He said it would only hurt once. The priest rose, startled. What did you say, my lady? But she did not answer. She seemed to listen to something distant, the rain perhaps, or the echo of her own scream in memory. That night, she worsened. Her pulse faltered, her breathing shallow and wet. The steward sent a messenger to recall the surgeon, but he was already gone, seen crossing the bridge before dawn, bound for another estate. The villagers said he never stayed where death lingered too long behind him. By midnight, delirium had claimed her. She thrashed weakly against the sheets, calling out for her husband, for her mother, for the saints to come and cool her fever. Her ladies tried to hold her still, but she clawed at her bandages, sobbing. Make it stop, she whispered. Please, make it stop. The priest began to pray again, his voice trembling, but she shouted over him. A sound raw with terror. He's still here, she cried. In the corner, watching. The ladies froze. They turned toward the dark edge of the room. There was nothing there but the surgeon's empty stool, the bowl of blackened water, and the faint shimmer of a blade forgotten beneath it. The priest crossed himself. Rest, my lady, there is no one here. But Isabeau shook her head, tears cutting through the sweat on her face. He's waiting to finish it. Her voice broke. The fever carried her words into madness. By morning, she was still, too still. The steward touched her wrist, found a faint flutter of life, and exhaled in relief. But relief, like mercy, did not last long in that room. The surgeon's fire had left its mark. The flesh around the wound turned the color of ash. The skin cracked and split where the iron had seared it. Each breath was shorter than the last. The priest wrote later that her strength ebbed not as a candle gutters, but as a rope phrase, strand by strand, sound by sound. Her heart fought the inevitable, but infection had already reached her blood. On the second evening, she awoke suddenly, her voice clear for the first time in days. The knife was clean, she whispered. It was not his fault. Her ladies leaned close, weeping. Rest, my lady, rest. But she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knows the end has already arrived. No, she said, the knife did what it was made to do. She turned her face toward the window, where lightning flared across the horizon, illuminating the rain-slicked stone. It cut me free. Those were her last words before she slipped back into silence. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, her breathing slowed, then stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Then the priest bowed his head, whispering the final rites. The ladies wept softly. The steward blew out the candles one by one, until only the dying embers of the hearth remained. By dawn, the castle was still. The siege was long over, but death had taken its time, claiming its last victory. And when the surgeon's name was spoken again, it was not in gratitude, it was in fear. The dawn that followed her death was too quiet. Even the crows, which usually circled above the ramparts, kept their distance from Montfort, La Roche. In the upper chamber, the air was heavy with the scent of candle wax and decay. The priest had performed the last rites hours before, his voice breaking as he blessed her still body. Now the room stood untouched, as if frozen in the moment between breath and nothingness. Lady Isabeau lay as though sleeping. The fever's flush had drained from her face, leaving her pale and strangely serene. Only the wound beneath the bandages told the truth. A blackened ruin sealed by fire, its edges stiff and cracked. Her ladies could not bring themselves to look at it. They dressed her in white, combed her dark hair, and placed a small crucifix upon her chest. When they drew the sheet over her, the priest murmured, "May God forgive the hands that tried to save her." But in the courtyard below, no one spoke of forgiveness. The surgeon had vanished before dawn, taking the road east toward Rennes. He left no mark of his passing, save the faint copper smell that clung to the flagstones. Some said they saw him stop once on the bridge, glancing back at the castle before disappearing into the mist. Others swore he didn't look back at all. By midday, the household was in chaos. Servants whispered that her body twitched in the night, that her eyes had opened for a moment as the bell of prime rang. The steward silenced such talk, yet he too avoided the upper hall, his footsteps quickening whenever he passed her door. Death had made her presence heavier, not lighter. The castle physician, a timid man of books, not blood, examined the wound before burial. What he found sickened him. The fire had seared deep, but infection had burrowed deeper still, creeping along veins and sinew until it reached her heart. No blade could have stopped it. No hand could have drawn it out. She was doomed the moment he touched her, he whispered. When the surgeon's name was spoken, it carried unease. He was said to have studied in France, in the schools where men dissected the bodies of criminals to learn the secrets of death. They said he'd once been condemned himself, reprieved only because he could mend a soldier faster than a prayer could. Now, people called him Le Croc de Dieu, God's hook, a man who cut away what heaven had already claimed. Lady Isabeau was buried that evening in the chapel beside her ancestors. The sky was low and gray, the earth soft from rain. Only a handful attended, her priest, her steward, and 3 weeping women who had once braided her hair. No bells tolled, no hymns echoed. The siege had left too many dead to mourn one more. They lowered her into the ground, wrapped in linen, not silk. The coffin was plain, made hastily by the carpenter who refused payment, saying only, "Let her rest." When the first shovelful of earth struck the lid, the sound was hollow, final. Yet as the priest began his prayer, a chill wind swept through the chapel, scattering candlelight. The flame flickered and went out. The steward swore he saw movement then, not of the body, but of the cloth, as if it had shifted slightly, drawn by the air. The priest told him it was the wind, but the steward would never again walk that corridor after dark. By the week's end, the castle began to empty. Soldiers departed, servants fled. Word had spread through the villages Montfort, La Roche was cursed. They said, the lady's ghost walked the battlements where she'd once stood, her white gown darkened at the shoulder, her right arm hanging lifeless at her side. Sometimes she was seen by the outer wall, looking toward the forest where the surgeon had vanished. Sometimes she was heard in the chapel whispering softly as if in prayer. But those who listened closely claimed the words were not prayers at all. They were questions. Why did you not stop him? Why did he not stay? Months passed, the banners faded. The walls grew damp with moss, yet the chamber where she died remained locked. By order of the steward, the key hung from his neck until his death years later. And even then, no one dared open the door. When, at last, her heirs returned to the castle decades later, they found the room untouched. Dust lay thick on the table where the surgeon had set his tools. The bowl of blackened water still stood by the hearth, undisturbed, and on the wall above the bed, a faint stain shaped like a hand burned into the stone itself. The priest who blessed the chamber before they left whispered that it was not her hand, but his, the mark of the man who had come with fire time, however, is merciful to memory. Stories softened, details blurred. Some called her a martyr, others a warning, but one truth endured. The surgeon's knife had promised deliverance and given only ruin. In the villages, mothers hushed their children with her name. "Lie still," they said, "or the surgeon of Montfort will come for you." And somewhere beyond the forests and the years, the legend grew. Travelers spoke of a woman seen at crossroads on stormy nights, her shoulder blackened, her face serene. She asked only one question of those who passed by. Did it hurt? When they answered yes, she smiled. Then you still live. Years turned slowly over Montfort La Roche, and still, the name of Lady Isabeau was whispered as though she might hear it. Time, which erases kings and crowns, refused to bury her completely. The castle's stones remained, its chapel cold and hollow, but her shadow clung to both. Travelers spoke of a presence there. Something felt before it was seen, a heaviness in the air, like a breath held too long. Her story passed from generation to generation, shedding its facts like old skin until it became something between memory and omen. Some said she had died bravely, refusing to scream as the surgeon's iron burned her flesh. Others swore she cursed his name with her final breath, that her ghost appeared to those who took the surgeon's trade as warning. Children in Brittany were told not to wander alone at dusk, for the Dame Blanche de Montfort would ask if they believed in mercy, and if they lied, she would take their voice. But beyond the legend lay the truth of her time, a truth colder than ghosts. In the 14th century, to fall ill or be wounded was to enter a world where salvation and suffering were indistinguishable. Surgeons worked by instinct and superstition, guided by humors, by prayers, by the smell of the wound more than its sight, bloodletting, cauterizing, amputation. These were the edges of hope. The men who wielded blades were both feared and needed, condemned and summoned in the same breath. Guillaume Lefebvre, the barber surgeon who had stood over Lady Isabeau, was never seen again in Brittany. Some said he died in plague months later, consumed by the same infection he had once tried to cure. Others said he traveled north, changing his name, carrying his satchel from one battlefield to the next. But among those who remembered Montfort, his face lived on. In tavern tales, in dreams, in the scrape of steel drawn too slowly from its sheath. Historians centuries later would call her death an inevitability of the age. They would write of gangrene and septicemia, of humoral imbalance and the absence of knowledge. They would say her fate was not unique, that hundreds, thousands, had met the same end under the same knife. But to those who lived in her shadow, there was nothing inevitable about it. There was choice, there was pride, there was fear disguised as faith. The priest who buried her lived another 10 years. In his final confession, he told of the night she died. He said the air had changed when the surgeon's knife pierced her skin, how the candles had bent inward, how the sound of her scream had seemed to come from both within and beyond the room. It was not merely pain, he wrote. It was a soul being torn from flesh by the pretense of mercy. That confession was found centuries later, its ink faded to brown, its pages brittle with mold. But his last line remained legible. We called it healing because we could not bear to call it what it was. By then, the world had changed. Medicine had advanced. Pain could be silenced. Infection understood. The surgeon's knife had become an instrument of salvation, not death. Yet even as scalpels grew cleaner and wounds survivable, the echo of the old fear lingered, the knowledge that once to be opened was to be judged, to be cut was to risk damnation as much as decay. Today, tourists who visit the ruins of Montfort, La Roche still speak of the upper chamber. The air there feels colder, they say. The walls smell faintly of iron when the rain falls. Some claim to hear a faint scratching at night, the echo of a knife drawn across wood. Others passing by the chapel say they see a woman in white kneeling by the altar, her head bowed, her right shoulder marked by shadow. When the lightning flashes, she is gone. Whether ghost or memory, Lady Isabeau's story endures because it holds a truth too human to forget, that in the Middle Ages, pain was not an accident of illness. It was part of the cure. Every scream, every cut, every prayer over blood. Soaked linen was a bargain struck between desperation and ignorance. And those who survived bore not only scars, but gratitude, twisted, misplaced, but real. Lady Isabeau did not survive. But her death, cruel and needless, became the mirror of her time, a reflection of an age that longed to save what it did not yet understand. Centuries later, her grave remains in the chapel of Saint Hilaire, a simple stone, no inscription but her name. Visitors leave flowers, coins, and sometimes a surgeon's scalpel, rusted and wrapped in linen. Perhaps it is superstition, perhaps reverence, or perhaps some small, unspoken apology from a world that finally learned to heal without hurting. For though her body is gone, her lesson lingers, that mercy once came with a blade, and that the hands which meant to save her became the ones that sealed her fate. And so her story endures, because pain, once given a name,